Now, for more on the upcoming U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue, Jack Perkowski joins us. He's a managing partner at a global investment firm, JFP Holdings. Welcome to the show. This is going to be quite a fascinating week on the backdrop of some controversial topics and some not so controversial topics. What do you expect?
Well, I think that what business people expect all over the world is for the two countries to come to some agreements with respect to some economic cooperation, but also to resolve or at least start to address some of the differences between the countries, because what businessmen want most is stability. And I think if a stable relationship between the United States and China is in everybody's best interest.
I think there's a thought that, we often talk about the number of jobs created here by Chinese companies, the amount of investment being here in the United States. Does that ultimately sway how people view China in the U.S.?
Oh, definitely. And I think there's also a little apprehension about, Chinese investors coming into the U.S. And I think the more of that happens, that apprehension tends to go down. But then I think if people see, or if American citizens see that China's actually creating jobs in the U.S., that's obviously going to do a lot to to reduce any tensions that may exist. Also, the more familiarity between the two countries, between the people of the two countries, is good for everyone.
What's missing between the two countries? I mean, we have long discussions about it, on the record and off the record, of how to fix this or how to mitigate this. Any ideas on your side?
I just think there's just a lot of uncertainty. I think people don't really don't have enough interaction. I think most Americans haven't had a chance to really directly interface with Chinese or to visit China, and the same thing from the point of view of the Chinese. So I think the more you have, the more dialogue, the more interchanges, the more visits, I think that'll start to increase familiarity, which I think is the first step to creating the kind of trust that you need to have between countries.
Back to business on this greenfield versus brownfield. One is creating from the ground up. One is sort of investing in existing projects. Walk us through the changes you've seen in the last couple of years and what the likely trend will be.
Well, first of all, there's clearly been much more Chinese investment in the United States, from virtually nothing 5-6 years ago to, I think, last year there was something like $14 billion that China invested in the U.S. So that's been a big change. And the other within that, of course, you mentioned it earlier, but real estate has been a big area for investment by the Chinese, but also a growing area. And again, something you mentioned earlier is the whole R&D area. We find that Chinese companies find that they can accelerate their development process by having R&D facilities in the United States. So that's a growing trend. The other thing that I would point out is I think you're going to see more and more acquisitions of U.S. companies by Chinese companies as they seek to increase their levels of technology and also become global players, not just players in China. So I think that you're going to see increasing investment, not just in greenfield facilities, but also in Chinese companies basically investing in American business.
Isn't it difficult, though, you might be the CEO of a major company and you're doing business with China, and that's great, but this against the backdrop of some of the politically more controversial topics that the White House is dealing with, how does a CEO or a manager or a business manager manage that sort of complex relationship?
Well, I think overriding all of the complexity is the fact that China is a very large market. In fact, in most products and services, it's now the largest market in the world. So if you're the CEO of a major company, it's very hard to ignore China. And so certainly, while there are these uncertainties and complexities in the bilateral relationship, the market is just really too big a market to ignore. So one way or another, you have to come to grips with it. That's why I mentioned at the outset that stability is really what everybody wants in terms of the relationship between the two countries and the two governments.
On Thursday, at the end of these meetings at the White House and here in Washington, do you expect any news on economic relations between the two that would further push it along forward?
Well, I think there's going to be some general agreements, announcements, cooperation in areas like environment. I wouldn't, be surprised to see, some type of relationships in the healthcare area. That's a big industry in China that is now opening up to outside investment and technology, and I think that that's something that's, very much in the minds of the Chinese leaders, how to, improve the healthcare for their citizens. So I think we can expect to see, some broad statements about cooperation in key areas like the environment and healthcare, and that will, of course, pave the way for further cooperation between the two countries.
Jack Perkowski, thank you very much. Good to have you on, by the way, starting us off on the strategic and economic dialogue.